Okay, so as our last lecture of today, we'll have Professor Boudet, who's going to talk us about his long work on Fournival's, Richard de Fournival's Nativitas. So, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, my PowerPoint is very old today and old-fashioned. Richard de Fournival is the son of Roger, physician to Philip Augustus, and probably astrologer, not officially, but he was canon of Amiens in 1239, then around 1240, by the grace of his half-brother, Arnaud de la Pierre, who was Bishop of Amiens, Chancellor of the Cathedral Church of Amiens, after having been chaplain of the Cardinal Robert de Sommercourt. So he has acquaintance indirectly with the court of the Pope. He's especially known by a French medievalist, but not only, for being the author of two important texts, the Bestiaire d'Amour, the Bestiary of Love, the date is not known, middle of the 13th century, a kind of moralized love bestiary in prose, very original and interesting, preserved in at least 23 manuscripts, which is quite important for vernacular texts, and the Biblionomia, probably finished after 1244, a reasoned but partial description of Richard's library, including more than 162 manuscripts that he wanted to make available to the students of Amiens, very important city on the north of France. But the Biblionomia is preserved in a single codex of the 14th century, and there is a new edition in preparation by Christopher Lequin, and it has been also attributed to Richard de Fournival, but probably wrongly. Last articles seems to design more Roger Bacon than Fournival. The De Vetula, a poem astrological for the third part, placed under the name of Ovid, and he is more likely the author of a treatise on alchemy, preserved in 11 codices and signed in the explicit of the oldest manuscript, Florence, Bibliotheca Medicena, plus 3029, Arcturus, qui est Ricardus de Fournival. Arcturus, what does it mean exactly? Now, this very manuscript, preserved in Florence, which contains the treatise on alchemy attributed to Richard, apparently copied in Paris around 1260-1280, is also the oldest copy of a work which was initially anonymous and untitled, which was attributed from the second quarter of the 14th century onwards to Albertus Magnus, first under the title of Tractatus Alberti de Continentia Librorum Astronomicorum et Differentiarum qui sint noxi et qui non, title given in the thematic repertory of the Libraria Communis of the Sorbonne College near 1321-1338. Then, from the second part of the 14th century, with the title of Speculum Astronomiae, and because of the attribution to Albertus, preserved in more than 60 manuscripts, and even if at the beginning it was an anonymous treatise, he began to have a lot of authority at the end of the Middle Ages because of the attribution to Albertus Magnus. There are many similarities between the astronomical manuscripts described in the Biblionomia, especially number 5360, and the astronomical treatises listed in the Speculum, chapter 2. Hence, the hypothesis formulated by David Pingree and Paola Zambelli, who were both convinced that the Speculum was written by Albertus Magnus, or a close associate of his, and who thought that Albert has access to the library of Richard de Fournival. But the attribution of the Speculum to Albert seems no longer to be supported, since the Codicological Survey, published in 2001 by Agostino Paravicini, whereas a series of convincing arguments were put forward in 2000 by Bruno Roy and more recently by Charles Burnett, to propose eventually an attribution, which is more simple solution, of the Speculum to Richard de Fournival. You have the two articles of Bruno Roy and Charles here on the slide. I shall try to revisit this hypothesis on the basis of a comparison between especially the chapter 8 on the Nativities of the Speculum, but not only, and a small text yet unpublished and attributable to Richard de Fournival, the so-called Nativitas. It's not a real title, but the word Nativitas is just at the beginning of the text. Indeed, Richard seems to be the author of what might be considered, even if this very short text remains at the technical preliminaries, we'll see that, as a kind of one of the oldest, or the oldest astrological autobiography in the history of the medieval West, a Nativitas which seems to have been composed before 1239, preserved in 4 manuscripts and commented on a generation later, probably before 1273, by the theologian and astronomer Pierre de Limoges. I refer, of course, here to the famous article of Birkenmeier, published in ISIS in 1949. And in this paper, Birkenmeier retraces his research from his first discovery of the Nativitas in 1912 to the publication of this study in 1949, offering, he says, his eventual successor all the elements necessary to bring to a successful conclusion the work he will have left unfinished. And so, try to finishing that work is what we are trying to do with Christopher Lueken, but it's a difficult job for many reasons. Our edition of the Nativitas with the commentary of Pierre de Limoges, which is quite interesting, with Christopher Lueken is still in preparation, and I shall refer today in your handout. You have that a big handout with the whole text of the Nativitas. I will refer to the oldest and best manuscript, Vaticano Reslat 1261, which was annotated and possessed by Pierre de Limoges after Richard's death, probably around 1260, but before, certainly also 1273. I translate the beginning of paragraph 1. I want to put forward that my birth took place under the ascendant sign of Virgo. So he's, from the beginning, persuaded that his ascendant was Virgo, probably because his father was an astrologer, I think, after midnight, but he doesn't know exactly the day, the how. After midnight, on the morrow of Saint-Denis, and that the day which was arising was that of Mercury. I deduce, therefore, that my birth took place after 1200 years of God, 7 months since that of March, and 9 days were accomplished. So, counting the years that have elapsed since the beginning of the Christian era, the months from March, considered to be the first month of the year in the astronomical tables of the 13th century, we'll see that, and the number of days, we deduce that Richard was probably born on Wednesday, October the 10th, 1201, the following day of Feast of Saint-Denis, being between midnight and daybreak. But at what time exactly? Perhaps if he had an horoscope of his birth done by his father, he could knew that. But it seems that he doesn't, and so he doesn't know the time exactly. That's why he has to resort to a method of finding out known as Animoda, from the Arabic an-namuda, coming itself from a Persian word meaning that what shows, a term that is defined as investigatio gradus ascendentis alicuius nativitatis in the 4th chapter of Alcabisius Liber Introductorius, translated from Arabic around or just before 1135. This indicator, the Animoda, designated the planet which, at the moment of the conjunction or opposition of the Sun and the Moon, which precedes the birth, is the lord of the degree of the zodiac where this conjunction or opposition takes place. The commentary of Halley, that is to say Abu Jafar Haman ibn Yusuf, to the 34th proposition of the Santiloquium of the Pseudo-Ptolemy, accompanying the Mondanorum version in manuscript famous of the Bibliothèque Nationale, Latin 16204, a very famous anthology of astrological texts, mainly translated from Arabic into Latin by John of Seville, which was thought, that manuscript, to have been copied for Richard de Fournival, but which in fact seems to have been copied after his death in 1260 and may well have been copied from one or more manuscripts that belong to him. That famous manuscript called in the 34th proposition of the Santiloquium, called this indicator Animoda Ptolemy, and affirms that it is an unavoidable technique for the determination of the nativity of the human beings. Once the Animoda has been established, it is possible to determine the degree, not only the sign, but the degree of the ascendant, etc. In the second paragraph of Richard's Nativitas, you have the text, he asserts that his nativity was conjunctionalis, which means that the knowledge of the exact moment of his birth depends on the conjunctions of the two luminaries that precede it. In order to seek by the Animoda the degree of the ascendant in Virgo, one must begin by situating the conjunction or new moon which precedes the birth. He says that this conjunction took place after 200 years, 6 months, 28 days, 12 hours, and 28 minutes afternoon of the previous day. That is to say, on September 29 at 28 in the sign of Libra, the Sun finding itself at 12.67 and the Moon at 12.1649. One needs subsequently to determine the lord of this conjunction. According to the different rulers who govern the 5 dignities of the degree of the conjunction, Richard considers that the animoda can be either Venus, Saturn, or Mercury. In the following paragraphs 4 to 6, each of these 3 possibilities is carefully examined in order to determine the planet which, having the most power, will be chosen to fulfill this function. After examining these 3 possible animodas, Richard finds that Venus, who has her domicile in the place of the conjunction of the luminaries preceding the house of birth, has 5 dignities. We call that fortitudines, not dignitates. But Saturn, who has its exaltation and its decan, facies, has also 5 dignities. Of course, he's applicating the alphabetious hierarchy of the dignities. And Mercury, which has its triplicity and its term, has also 5 dignities. These 3 planets are therefore equal in power and dignity, except that Mercury looks by aspect at the degree of the conjunction, and that one must take into account the part of power that this aspect possesses. Furthermore, according to the nature of the places in which they are at the moment of birth, Saturn and Venus, which would be respectively one in Pisces, the other in Scorpio, would be in place in which they have no power. Neither of these 2 planets would be situated in its domicile, exaltation, etc. And as it specified, Venus is here peregrine, which means that this planet is neither in its domicile nor in its exaltation, and Saturn is retrograde. On the other hand, Mercury, which is in Libra, in its triplicity, is considered by Richard as Zaman or Zamin, placed in the heart of the Sun. Mercury appears for him at the maximum of its strength. Mercurius Zaman incordis solis, fortium quam esse possit. Zaman or Zamin comes from the Arabic shamin, in the heart, and translated in Latin by incorde solis in the translation of John of Seville of the Introductorium Magnus of Abu Masha. It designates the position of a planet located up to 16 minutes of arc on either side of the Sun. This position is considered as very favorable in astrology, whereas the combustio or adustio of a planet by the Sun between 16 minutes and 6 degrees of arc is considered, on the contrary, as harmful. But you'll see, of course, there is a problem. That in the figura Caeli, not in the conjunction, but in the figura Caeli of the birth, with the Sun at 23 Libra and Mercury at 23.6, Mercury is in fact at a distance of 17 minutes from the Sun, not 16 minutes. So there is perhaps a problem that can be resolved, I think, because the horoscope of the conjunction is, of course, not the same than the horoscope of the birth itself. Anyway, Richard concludes that Mercury seems to be the most powerful planet. Therefore, it will be the Animodar, knowing that the ascendant sign of the Richard's birth is the sign of Virgo, where Mercury is both in domicile and in exaltation. Of course, the importance that Richard Fournival ascribes to Mercury in his celestial configuration and to Virgo as his ascendant is highly significant. Indeed, Richard states at the beginning of his Biblionomia that, I quote, a man, him, among the sons of Amiens, exercised in the mathematical sciences, was able to establish, with God help, but not without difficulty, that the ascending sign at the time of his birth was similar to the ascendant of the first foundation of this city. Il est Amiens, of course. He therefore desired as far as he was able, but all the more viscerally, as it was similar to it in its celestial configuration, that the situation of his city would be exalted. Richard thus seems to refer in the Biblionomia to the search for his birth ascendant that he carried out in the Nativitas. On the other hand, he was informed about the date of the foundation of Amiens by a note contained in a manuscript of astronomy and astrology which belonged to his father, Roger, also born in Amiens, and who says, I quote, Anno ab urbe condita, etc., 867, refundata est civitas abienensis ubi natus est. So, the birth ascendant of Amiens, it seems about 114 EC, AD, is implicitly placed by Richard in the sign of Virgo, in which Mercury exerts the greatest power, as in his own birth horoscope. So, Richard himself was born on the day of Mercury, on Wednesday. The Animodar selected to determine the precise degree of his ascendant is Mercury. We'll see that it's located in 23.6 of Libra. This planet is in a dominant position in its triplicity, and we'll see also that Mercury is considered by him as the alcocode, that the orthograph precise of the Order's manuscript, or alcosoden, that is to say, the giver of life, which makes it possible to determine the length of life, the life expectancy. Richard is now able to supplement the information he had previously given for birth, whose ascendant was fixed at 23.6 degree in Virgo, in the third phase of Virgo, ruled also by Mercury. And he can also draw the astrological charts corresponding to the exact degree of his ascendant. We'll see that on the next slide, where the date of the birth is given here at the middle of the square. You see that the manuscript is very interesting. It was copied by a scribe at the request of Pierre de Limoges, who annotated the copy in the margin. Not all the margin here are that part is Latin by the scribe, but you see all this are the commentary of Pierre de Limoges. And he has done another much more longer commentary, which is not preserved in that manuscript, but in later manuscripts. And that commentary is signed Petrus Limovicensis. So we are sure about the identity of the commentator if we are not absolutely sure, and himself probably doesn't know the identity of Richard de Fournival, which is, it seems from the beginning, anonymous. Here is the square with the ascendant Virgo in the first house, of course, a conjunct Mars in the beginning, at the beginning of the second house, Mercurius direct and in conjunction with the Sun in the second house, etc. You see that Jupiter is in Sagittarius in the fourth house. You have in the sixth house the Pars Hileg. Saturn is on the seventh house and retrograde. The moon is at the beginning of Pisces. You have on the ninth house the Pars Mortis and the Pars Fortunae. And you have on the 10th house in Gemini the Pars Matris, the lot of the mother, the Guzar, that is the head of the dragon, and the Pars Vitae, and you have in the 11th house the Pars Contentionum. That may be interesting. For the astronomical tables that were probably used by Richard, Pierre de Limoges says it is the first annotation that Richard used the Toulouse tables, a version of the Toledan tables adapted to the Christian calendar and to the Toulouse meridian, frequently used by Parisian astronomers in the 13th century because of the proximity in longitude between Toulouse and Paris. There is a manuscript of the Toledan tables kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale, but not of the Toulouse tables, unfortunately. If we check with the deviations software developed by Raymond Mercier, the accuracy of the position of the planets, he doesn't give the Toulouse table's position, but the Toledan one, and except for Saturn, whose position shows an abnormal deviation of nearly 2 degrees of longitude, the other planetary positions are quite reliable. You can see that. It's only Saturn who have a problem. So the astronomical substratum on which the Nativitas is based seems to be quite solid, at least as far as the position of the planets is concerned. But what about astrology? I don't speak here about the houses today. Indeed, once this astrological chart, anyway, it is, I think, the standard version of domification in the typology of John North. The only real judgment, if we can call this a judgment, Richard draws from his Figura Caeli, concerns some events on the length of his life. According to Ptolemy's Quadripartitum, the method which over all others is more in accord with natural reason is that which is derived from the place of the Heleg, as I quote the translation of the Plato of Tivoli's translation of the Quadripartitum. Planets which have power over the Heleg and which the places of the destructive stars. The Heleg, you know that, is the Dator Vitae, who gives the initial impulse to the life of the subject and is coupled afterwards to the Alcocode or Alcosoden, synonym of Significator Vitae or Dator Annorum, which is the master of the geniture, dispensers of the years of life that allows to measure the amount of life to which a first impulse has been given. In the Nativitas, paragraph 12, given that the master of the geniture happy, free, and healthy, the individual in question seems to be able, says Richard, to have a long life, ius Dei. The position of the moon in the third house, cadens ab angulo, does not allow the moon to be the Heleg. So, even if it is a nocturnal nativity, the sun is suitable to be the Heleg because it is in a succedent angle in house 2, in conjunction with Mercury, who is the master of his own triplicity. As for the Alcosoden, it will be Mercury, for, as had already been indicated regarding the Animodar, this planet is supposed to be Zamin and situated in a succedent angle, house 2. It grants, therefore, an average of 40 years of life, and the source here not indicated, but that we can deduce of Richard is obviously the De Nativities of Abu Ali al-Hayat, Albo Ali, chapter 4, which was contained originally in manuscript BNF Latin 16204, and gives a table of the years given by each of the planets according to its position in the 12 heavenly houses. And have highlight here the 48 years given by Mercurius, the 12 years given by Jupiter, the 19 months given by the Sun, and the 15 years which is sustained by Mars. I don't still insist on the detail because the time is passing. This gives a next life expectancy of 58 years and 9 months, without the month given by the Sun. Therefore, diminishes the Sun is magnificent because of its conjunction, so it would be moins 19 and not, sorry. Therefore, the subject will be 57 years and 2 months of life expectancy. This brings us to December the 10th of 1258. Since Richard, according to the obituary of Amiens Cathedral, seems to have died on March the 1st, 1260, this prediction was not too optimistic and maybe perhaps too accurate to be authentic. That's what thought Daniel Jacquard during the Congress on Richard de Fournival. And one might wonder if the Nativitas was not completed after the death of its author. But I do not think that this is the case for two reasons. First, it's not totally exact. And second, I think it was only a working that you have. It's not at all, it's a provisional work. It's not at all a real prediction. It's not a judgment of a nativity. It's only a technical preliminary. And an anonymous text from the beginning. It is reasonable, I think, to think that the author of this text composed it for himself, Richard, and that he had no intention of any circulation of its text. He must not have felt the need to sign it or to specify the identity of the subject concerned within the astrological square, as is often the case. And Pierre de Limoges, in his commentary, speak about the author, actor nativitatis. That's all. So I don't think that this pseudo prediction, this calcul, has been done afterward. Richard also employs in the last paragraph, 2 profections of the ascendant and 9 different directions. I don't insist. You have the place in the year when the profection of the ascendant reached the lot of the death of the father, the pars mortis patris. If it is okay, it should probably down at 1222, and probably Roger has died at the age of 43 in 2022. For the death of his mother and her lot, the lot of the mother is at 15 degrees 7 Cancer in Richard horoscopes. Richard refers to the direction of the lot of the mother at the point where the sign of Taurus passed into that of Aries, and according to the direction of Venus at the sextile of Mars, and the direction of the middle of the sky at the square of Mars, she would have died approximately in 1233 at the moment determined by the direction of the mothers, of the lot of the mothers at the point where the sign of Taurus passed into that of Aries, so probably in 1233. The third event is a quartan fever, I don't insist, and the last past event mentioned by the Nativitas is a serious injury that the author would have received from an inhabitant of Arras or its region in the same year that he would have lost his father. And there are different directions to be used about that. Richard completes his Nativitas by indicating three specific moments of which he must be wary in the future. The first one, an event whose nature is not specified, is to be feared at the moment determined by the direction of the ascendant, that is to say the Algebuta, but according to Alcabisius, but Fournival doesn't use the term, to Mars, and without going into the details, after the age of 38 years and 12 days, or from the 22nd of October 1239, date before which the Nativitas was probably composed, unless one considers the other directions much later who's possible. So such is the fate of the son of Amiens. As for his city, he seems to be convinced that his birth ascendant was in the sign of Virgo, which, for a Christian scholar of the 13th century, necessarily has an apologetic meaning. Let us think of chapter 12 of the Speculum Astronomiae, which, interpreting a famous passage of the Introductorius Maius of Albumachar, situated the ascendant of Christ's nativity, birth, in the first decan of Virgo. You have that on the Zoterus of the British Library. And thanks, this is perhaps one of the reasons, even if the ascendant of Richard was in the third decan, not in the first, like the Christ. This is one, perhaps, of the reason of identify himself to the Christ in some way. We are just at the moment of the building of the Gothic Cathedral of Amiens, and he was the chancellor of the church. Let us now have a look on the chapter 8 of the Speculum. I quote, "The parts of Nativities teach us about nativities of those for whom they are signifiers of the growth of a child. It teaches how first to select the place of the Helig from amongst the luminaries and the lot of fortune, and also from the degree of the ascendant and the degree of the conjunction or opposition of the sun and moon, which preceded the birth. It teaches how, secondly, to choose the place of the Alcosoden, which is from amongst the lords of the four dignities of the place of the Helig, which are its house, exaltation, its domicile, exaltation, term, and triplicity. He forgets the decan. There is only 4 essential divinities here, and not 5, which are quoted precisely in the Nativitas of Richard. That's an important difference. Etc. And to judge the length of life of the native by means of the direction of the degree of the Helig to the place of the cutting off, and also by means of the gift of the years of the Alcosoden, together with the increase and decrease resulting from the planet's aspect to it, not certainly how long he must live by necessity, that's the captatio benevolentiae of a Christian of the 13th century, but the time beyond which his life is not extended by nature. And together with this, to direct, to prorogate the degree of the ascendant and degree of the moon for the occurrence of disease and of health in the body, but the degree of the mid-heaven and the degree of the sun for his being in rulership, and the degree of the lot of fortune for his acquisition of riches, and also for his father, to look from the sun and the Lord of the fourth place, but for his mother from the moon and the Lord of the mid-heaven, and also to direct, to prorogate, the lot of the Hileg. You see that, remember that the lot of the Hileg was on the chart, the astrological chart of Richard, just at the place of the Hileg is directed, excepted that it is directed retrogressively, and in addition, to know the modes of the direction from the divider, the divisor, that is the algebuta. These terms are not in the Nativitas. And from the Lord of the rays and from the receptions of their dispositions, etc. It also teaches to evolve the years of the native from the sign of the profection for determining the more important events in the lives of the native, and from the ascendant of the revolution for the less important events. And finally, to judge the dignities of the native and its accidents by means of mixing together the almutem and the ascendant, and with the almutem, however, in certain places on the circle of the 14 different ways which indicate good effect of destruction by the common God. And he quotes his sources, the quadripartitum of Ptolemy, the third part, the De Nativitatibus of Omar Tiberiadis, Umar al-Tabari, the De Nativitatibus of Al-Buali, and the second part of the pseudo John of Seville, Epitome Totius Astrologiae, or Quadripartitum. Alors, let's have a look now to the terminology. And I finish by this comparison. In the Nativitas, on the left, in the Speculum, on the right. Ascendens, Gradus Ascendens, Nativitas, in the both. Nativitas Conjunctionalis, Nocturna is more specialized, is only on the Nativitas. Conjunctio, okay. Zaman, Zamin, it's not in the chapter 8 of the Speculum, but in the chapter 5. So the author of the Speculum knew the term. Animodar, it is not in the chapter 8, but it is in the chapter 9. I'll quote it. Fortidunines, Fortidunine, in the chapter 5, Dignitas, Domus, Exaltatio, Terminus, Facies, it's not in the 8th chapter of the Speculum, but in chapter 5. Why he omit Facies? I don't know. Triplicitas, Aspicere, Medium Celum, Angulus, etc., Cadere, Cades, etc. Akmar is a transliteration of Al-Kamar, the moon, not in the Speculum. Look at those two. Hiles, exactly the same transliteration. Al-Kokode, exactly the same transliteration. Pars Hiles, same thing. The different lots, I leave it out because it's much more specialized, and I don't quote here. You can see the handout, the second part of the paragraph 8 of the Nativitas, where there are more lots which are mentioned. The pars, in quote Timetur Mortis, etc. In quote Timetur Mors. Gezar, it's not in the Speculum, but they are Coda Draconis. Domini Nutritionis, you have Significatores Nutritionis in the Speculum. Directiones significatorum ad loca concisionis. Concisionis, no divisionis, which is the term more frequently used. And you have exactly the same words, directio gradus hiles ad loca concisionis in the speculum. Directio accidentis, no problem. Directio veneris, it's not interesting. Directio mediacili, etc. Profectio ascedetis, okay, no problem. There are only two words which are not mentioned in two expressions which are not mentioned in the Nativitas, but only in the Speculum. Divisor qui est algebutar ou algebutam. He speak about concisio only. And commixio almutem, the word almutem is not at all in the Nativitas. Thus, if I counted correctly, 25 terms or polylexical units of the technical meaning used in the Nativitas are found in chapter 8 of the Speculum, the most remarkable being the transliteration hiles and alcocode, and the expression directio ad loca concisionis, it is direction to the places of cutting, expression that have been found for the moment only, in the Nativitas and in the Speculum. While 7 terms, amongst the most significant, are not found in this chapter of the Speculum, in this chapter 8, but in other chapters, Zamin, Animoda, in chapter 9 on interrogation, cum almotam super ipsum gradum conjunctionis eu proventionis ipsius, qui est animoda in nativitatibus, in the chapter 9, fortitudines, and facies is found in chapters 5, 10, and 12 of the Speculum, but not in chapter 8, and that's a problem, I must admit. Admittedly, the word animoda, so crucial in Richard's Nativitas and so important when the precise term of the subject's birth is unknown, which is generally the case in the 13th century, is missing, is in chapter 8 of the Speculum, devoted to the Nativities, but it is present and properly contextualized in the next chapter 9 of the Speculum. On the other hand, 2 equally significant terms used in the Speculum are absent in the Nativitas. Divisor quest algebutam. You have the definition. It's no time to go back to that. But these differences in vocabulary can at least partly be explained by different contexts, practical for the Nativitas and theoretical and normative for the Speculum. And they are very much in the minority. In total, if we take into account chapters 5, 7, 8, and 9 of the Speculum, 3/4 of the terms of or polylexical units, technical of the Nativitas, out of 39, are found in the text of the Speculum. Of course, this common terminology is mostly due to common sources, in particular, Alcabisius Liber Introductorius, Albumazar Introductorius Major for Zamin and the Lords, including the Pars Contentionum, that's the Lords of the quarrels and adversaries, and the 2 Navitatibus by Alboali, which is one of the major sources of the Nativitas and of the chapter 8 of the Speculum, and by Aomar Tiberiadis, which is a secondary source of the Nativitas, and is mentioned at the end of chapter 8 of the Speculum. Qualitatively, I think that the polylexical unit directs you at loca concisionis, which have encountered nowhere else but in the Nativitas and the Speculum, seems significant. So, on the terminological level, and contrary to what I have previously argued, the Nativitas and the Speculum offer a rather coherent system, not in the detail for the directionists, in fact, but globally which constitutes an additional argument in favor of the attribution of the Speculum to Richard de Fournival. And let us recall that, like the Nativitas, written by a Servus Dei Gloriosi, the Speculum is first and foremost an anonymous work written by a quidam vir and also by a zelator fidei, who obviously did not want to reveal his identity. Proof not only of the relativity of the notion of author in the 13th century, but also of the limits of the intellectual freedom at that time when one tackles heated and controversial subjects at the border of the religious norm, such as astrology. Thank you. And sorry for... Sorry for the time.
Any questions?
This is not a question, but it's just to say I'm convinced by your argument.
Okay. That's enough. But it's a bottle, it's a message into the bottle because it's difficult.
I also have a question. Okay. Does it really work? Okay, right. The first question is that this concisio or concisio, this is a translation of an Arabic term. That's obvious, but
yes.
Itself, not in this form, but does this appear anywhere in the Latin translation, or is it special?
I didn't get it in Abu Masha. I checked in the Lemay edition of the great introduction. I tried. I searched it in many texts. I didn't see it. Well, for the moment, I don't know if, Charles, you have seen... Yes, yeah. The word, there is a special article on the notion of cut in Arabic astrology by Zenamatar, I think. It's an old one. But I don't know exactly where. It's not difficult to see the Arabic term. But the translation
like
is different.
It's related
it's concisio, and it is the same word used by the two texts. So that's all.
It is really convincing. Your point is really convincing. But if I understood it well, your main sort of concern is that while in the Nativitas, the animodar is or the amuten is calculated with the use of the face. In the Speculum, it is apparently missing.
Yeah. But in this chapter, not in the other.
Yeah,
but I don't understand why.
I can't.
Especially if it is the same author, that's a problem.
Yes, but if you think that maybe the Nativitas is an earlier work where he relied on Arcabisi and other Arabic astrologers, and in the Speculum, he revised himself and gave a bigger authority to Ptolemy, who who is the first source both in chapter 6 and chapter 8. So both the theoretical part and the Nativities. Then I guess that we have the solution.
Okay, thank you. It's quite a good hypothesis. Yes, that's right. The quadripartitum is quoted as. Absolutely. You are right. Yes, it can't explain a changing of point of view between the Nativitas and the Speculum, if it is the same author. So, thank you very much. It was obvious, but I didn't see that. Because I didn't remember that the facies were not in the text of the quadripartitum. That's the problem. So, thank you.
Okay, so
we are exhausted. Sorry.